Welcome to the first episode of Forging the Hilltop. Well, as the name implies, we are building the hilltop from The Walking Dead. This has been kind of a constant theme throughout my Forge career in Halo 5, and kind of extended into other versions of Halo as well, but especially in Halo 5. The hilltop plays a huge role in The Walking Dead. It's a new location on the show, and we haven't seen too much of it. However, with what we have gotten and what's available in the comics, we have a pretty good idea of what the hilltop looks like, as well as the overall layout. So, with the hilltop established, what type of map is this going to be? Well, following suit with the overall theme of The Walking Dead and what I've done in the past, it's fair to assume that this is going to be an infection map. In this episode, we'll be focusing on the Barrington house. The Barrington house is probably the most prominent feature of the hilltop. It's what they built the colony around. So building the exterior of the Barrington house wasn't too terribly difficult, although the roof was really hard to do because there's some tricky stuff with it, but I'll get into that a little bit later on. The first thing I was looking at with the images was the windows. I wanted to count how many there were and how far apart they were from one another. The idea is that when you're looking at a picture like that, you want to try to find some sort of reference point or some sort of scaling with the image, and I used the windows for that. So I established how wide I wanted my windows to be in the game itself. So in Forge, I established that they would be 8 units wide. And then from there, I kind of used that as a reference point. So when I looked at the picture and I knew that my windows in-game would be 8 units wide, I started thinking that the windows in the picture were 8 units wide as well, and then I worked off of that. So looking at the overall layout of the house, I saw that there was 3 windows on the left side of the door and 3 windows on the right side of the door, and that was basically duplicated up to the second floor, so you had an exact copy of the first floor on the second floor, making things pretty easy to do. As for spacing with the windows, I kind of had to improvise a little bit here. You can see in the picture that on the far left side of the building and the far right side of the building at the corners, it's a little bit wider there than it is between the 2 other windows. And then as you get closer to the door, it looks like it's a little bit narrow. On my version, I decided to make the window closest to the door have a bit bigger of a gap than it actually appears in the real version, but that's just to make the door work a little bit better for what I wanted. Overall, it's not a huge difference and you can't really tell, so I wasn't really too concerned with that. I'm okay with that level of improvisation with the overall layout of the house. When it comes to making windows and forging them, I never like to leave just a hole in the wall. I always like to add a little bit more. And this actually worked in my favor because in the show there is a white trim around the windows, so that allowed for an opportunity for me to add a little bit of a highlight to all of the windows. This is problematic because there is so many windows on the house that it requires quite a few blocks to actually pull off this trim, but when it's done, it looks really good and it doesn't look like, again, just a hole in the wall, so I always like to add a little bit more detail when I can. Working with glass in Forge is kind of tricky to do. The glass pieces look great and there's tons of different shapes that you can use, but the problem is that they're kind of thick. In my case, I was using cable pieces, which don't play around too well with glass, especially when you want the glass to be bi-directional, so you want players to look out of it and also into it. The trim pieces that I was using, the wires or the cables, don't really work with that thick of glass, so in place of that, I decided to use single grid pieces. Grid pieces are a great alternative to glass, but the problem with them is that if you're trying to cover a larger area, they don't really work because the grid pattern itself, you can't get it flush. You can alter the color of the different squares, but again, when you try to place it over a larger area, you can definitely tell it's grid and not glass. But if you have small windows like I do here, you can easily use grid pieces and alter the color and make them look exactly like glass. You don't get the seams and it just fits really nicely, so I use grid pieces here in place of glass. The next thing I did was add a bit of color to the building. Now the reason why I decided to do this now and not later on is because once you kind of have a base color down, you can start kind of visualizing additional highlights you might want to add to the building. So if you want to add like a wood trim or you want to add something else to it, you kind of get an idea when you start placing on the base color. So I wanted to figure out what I was going to use for brick with this house. So the easiest way to emulate brick in Forge right now, since we don't technically have a brick texture, is to simply throw on the stone texture, add some grime, and then play around with colors and the shininess. In pictures of the house, you can see that it kind of has just a regular brick color, which is really easy to do in Forge. So I set the color to brown, and I added a shininess of 3, and I set the grime to 2.5 on the scaling, which makes it a little less noticeable than normal, but it's still there. and this did a pretty good job of making it look like it does in the picture. The next thing was to make the front part of the house where you see the wooden supports and the balcony. To do this, I used pipe pieces and pipe caps. The reason why I used pipe caps is because if you look at the picture and you look closely, you can see that the supports have a bit of trimming at the bottom of them. There's some detail to it, so I used pipe caps to kind of make it look like the wood was kind of carved at the bottom. On the pipes and on the cap pieces, I set the texture to wooden and I set the primary color to white. This again emulates what I see in the picture. I wanted to make sure that the edges of the balcony also had the trimmed wood look, so it kind of looks like carved wood. To do this, I used jersey barrier pieces and I surrounded the entire balcony, and then of course I set the color to white on them, the shininess 0, and I added the wood texture, and that did a pretty good job of making it look just a little bit more interesting and not so boring and blocky. Of course, a balcony needs a railing, and this kind of was easy to do. I just used some more cable pieces, made sure that they were set to white, and encapsulated the entire balcony. So now there's a nice little railing to prevent players from falling off. So the next step was to add the roof overhang. The roof overhang can be done fairly easily. I just used a triangle piece, and then I slapped on wall pieces to emulate the roof itself. It's pretty easy to do, and ultimately I wasn't really satisfied with the way it looks, and I end up changing it a little bit later on. But for the time being, it worked out for what I want and kind of acted as more or less a placeholder for a better looking roof that was yet to come. I did have to establish how I wanted the overall roof to look, and you can see that in the show. It's a dark roof, and presumably there is shingles on it. We don't have shingles in Forge, and it would be way too expensive to try to emulate them, especially for a roof that you won't actually be close to. So what I did was I just used a black color, and then I pasted on the Forerunner texture, added a little bit of shine, and it kind of looks like a roof. It looks very similar to the roof that you see in the show. For the main roof, I thought I would use stair pieces and put them on an angle and then color them black and add the Forerunner texture, but it didn't really look that good, and it also posed another problem, and that was the corner of a roof. When it comes to buildings and making them in Forge, one of the most challenging parts is the roof, especially the corner of the roof. Since we don't technically have a corner roof piece, you have to more or less make one, and that can be really tricky to do when you're dealing with slanted roofs and you want to have a building that you can see from every angle. Normally you can just go ahead and slap on a flat roof or make it so that the building is only visible from one angle, and then you can just use a slanted roof. But when you're using a roof like this or making a building like this that has kind of a different look to it and you want to be able to go around the entire building, you need to get that corner roof piece down, and it's very tricky to do. Figuring this out was a nightmare, and that's an understatement. I was going on a Twitter rant at the time, and you can see those tweets where I was constantly posting about what I was doing, what I was trying, and how frustrated I was, because getting this corner piece was really, really difficult. However, the solution ended up being something mind-numbingly simple. Originally, I had tried using some Halo 3 era version of forging where I laid down a primitive piece on top of the angle that I needed, and then I pressed another piece on normal physics up into that angle, and then like duplicated it and twisted it around and tried some weird angle maneuvering to get it, and it looked okay, but it required like 30 objects to do all 4 corners, and that was just unacceptable. However, like I said, the solution ended up being something really simple. Now, you might already know this, and I probably sound like an idiot, but in case you don't, allow me to give you a short lesson on how to make corner roofs. So, you want to learn how to find the hidden lobster on Title, do you? No? You sure? It's a really cool Easter egg that summons a massive lobster. Okay, fine. Here's how to make a corner roof instead, I guess. Keep in mind that every roof is different, and you'll need to use different blocks depending on what your roof needs. The idea here is that you use this concept/function to make your own roof corners. The first step is to simply spawn 2 wall pieces and form them into a corner like this. Then you'll need to spawn a simple 2x2x2 primitive and place it on top of them. Rotate it so that it's on a 45-degree angle relative to the wall positions. Then group everything together and make sure that the 2x2x2 is the parent object. The reason for this is that now when you rotate the assembly, it will rotate much easier and you'll be able to get it into the proper orientation. Move your assembly over to the roof and rotate it into place. This will require some messing around to get it to sit properly. You might find that the wall pieces you used are too thick or too long. You'll need to bring your assembly back out and adjust it accordingly. It's trial and error. After you find 2 wall pieces that fit correctly, you'll need to add additional blocks. Again, this is trial and error. So rinse and repeat until all the holes are filled. Remember, this tutorial is only to show you a concept. There are many ways of going about doing this. It's completely up to you. I've made a prefab of this roof corner and you can download it right now if you want. There'll be a link in the video description. Good luck. And we're back. If you didn't know that already, I hope it helps you with your future Forge projects, and if you already knew how to do that, well, kudos to you. It took me way longer than it should have to figure that out, but again, the solution ended up being something super simple, and that's kind of always the case with Forge. After I got those 4 corners down, I proceeded to fill in the rest of the blanks with the roof, which was pretty easy to do. It just kind of was some basic object manipulation and playing around with the various coordinates and pushing the kind of angles to what they needed to be. It wasn't too complicated and was pretty easy to do. So the next thing to do was the fake window rooms. Presumably, these are windows that come out of the attic. And I didn't want to put a functioning attic in the map, so I just decided to use fake window rooms, or facade rooms, I guess you could call them. Another pet peeve I have when it comes to windows in Forge is when people take the facade windows and just slap them on the side of a building. Now, there are situations where that is required, and I've done it myself. You can see examples of that on days gone by. However, when you can, you always should try to make it so that those windows are actually inside of a window or inside of a cutout, and it will look a lot better. So that's what I did here. It requires a few more forge blocks, but the option is always there that if I want to, I can go back and alter this to free up some budget if I need to. So all I really needed to do here was build one of them and place it inside of one of the other windows I had, duplicate it and place it inside of another window, and then basically repeat this all the way across one side of the building, and then select all of those fake window rooms and move them up to the roof, push them in, and then kind of slightly manipulate them to get them into a position that kind of looks similar to the show. On the real Barrington house, there is more window rooms than I have here, but I decided to just go with 4, I believe. The reason for this is that it saves objects, and it looked too cluttered in a Forge map, so I took a little bit of artistic freedom and changed the number from 7 fake window rooms down to 4, and it just looks a lot better. After doing this, it was time to extrapolate the rest of the building. I always build one side of a building and then basically just duplicate everything over to the rest of the building. And this was really easy to do. All I needed to do was kind of copy over the window pattern onto the various walls or the 2 sides of the building, and then again just paste the rest of the roof elements onto that, using the same window trims, for the most part the same spacing, and kind of just, again, copying over one pattern. And once I built one side, all I needed to do was select it and move it over to the other side and flip a few things around, but for the most part it was really easy to do. Earlier I mentioned that the roof overhang was more or less a placeholder, and it is. I wanted to redo it. In the actual Barrington house, the roof overhang isn't as steep. It's kind of a flat roof, and I always want to go above and beyond when I can, and that's kind of the case here. I have the ability to make a roof that looks similar to that of the actual Barrington house, so I figured I would spend a little bit more time and redo what I made to make sure that it looks as good as it can. So this posed a bit of a challenge, and that's because we only have equilateral triangles in Forge, so filling in the triangles part of the overhang roof is kind of tricky. I wanted to make sure that I used as little blocks as possible to do so, and I'm sure there is another formula somehow where I can use fewer blocks, but in this particular case, I used quite a few to fill in the triangle section. And again, I kind of kept it the same as the original, or what I did originally, and that was to just make the intersection white and then the roof part black. So it's kind of the same deal, however, it's a different overall shape, and it looks more faithful to the original, and I'm happy that I decided to go ahead and redo that portion of the map. Speaking of redoing things on the house, I also wanted to redo the window trim pieces. Now, I did this for 2 different reasons. The first of which was block usage, and I understand I could have used a longer cable piece and extended it from the top window down into the bottom window, but ultimately the cable pieces just felt too narrow and too thin, and you didn't really notice them that well, so I decided to use a very thin portion of a wall and color it white, add the wood texture, and apply that to every single window. I think it looks a whole lot better. You can definitely tell that there is a trim piece in the window. When you stand from far away, you can see that it's there, whereas with the cable pieces, you could only see them when you got up close. So I think this looks a lot better, and it also looks more faithful to the original. And finally, the last thing I had to do for the exterior of the Barrington house was the octagon window lookout, which sits on top of the house. I'm going to go ahead and say that I don't actually end up using this in the final version of the house, at least currently right now with the build that I have. I didn't end up liking the way it looked, but I wanted to show myself building it anyways. So what I did was I used a bunch of facade windows and then kind of added a little bit of an angle around them and made a giant octagon. I then added some trims and kind of built it out and added like a piped kind of stand onto it to make it look kind of similar to the original, but ultimately I felt like it was too clunky and it didn't fit what I had built for the house, so I ended up removing it. But that about does it for the exterior of the Barrington house. If you stayed right to the very end of this episode, I appreciate it, and I look forward to doing more like this in the future. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like. I'll see you guys all next time. Stay tuned for another episode of Forging the Hilltop. I'll see you guys soon. Thanks for watching.